Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. The subject, as you can see here, is Layers Basics. We're going to create a triptych. A triptych is a great way to present multiple images, and Photoshop's Layers does make this a very quick and simple process. It's also a great project for learning more about layers, because once we create the artwork we need for a triptych, we can then use the same techniques for almost any multiple layout that we can dream up. What we're going to do first is to use layers to create a template, and that will form the basis of the triptych. The good thing is this artwork template is not just created for this one project, but we can save it and we can use it again and again. Layers will help us to do this, but we also have smart guides. Smart guides in Photoshop are really clever, and we don't even need to turn them on. Once we've got our template created, we can then use layers again to add the images into that template. Then we can apply some creative presentation techniques, such as fine lines around the edge of the images and perhaps drop shadows too. So let's get into it, because it's fun to do. I'm going to make a start by creating a new blank canvas to provide the base for all of the work we're going to do. I'm going to make it 16:9 aspect ratio. I'm going to make the assumption that I probably may want to make a print from this at some stage, so I'm going to keep it reasonably high resolution. So I'm going to go up to the top left of the screen and File New. I'm going to go over to the right hand side here, and I'm going to make my canvas 6000 pixels on the long side by 3375 on the height, and if you did any calculations you'll find that is in fact 16:9. We've got white selected as our background content. That's pretty good for what we want to do to start with, so let's create it, and there it is. Now I think it's going to be beneficial if I open up the layers permanently on screen so you can see them all of the time as we go through this work. The very first thing I'd like to do is to create a new blank layer over the top of my background. Now I can do that from the icon just to the left of the bin. There's the first of them. What I'm going to do on this layer is to create one piece of the triptych. I'm not going to measure it, I'm just going to use my eye and make a calculated guess at the size I want. To do that, I need to select my rectangular marquee tool from the top left of the toolbar. This is the one that I want, the square one, rectangular marquee tool. I'm going to go somewhere in the center of the document, click and drag, and as I said, I'm trying to just guess. Can you see the gap on the right and the left? So I'm going to create my selection something like that. Now because that selection has been created on a new blank layer, I can flood it with black, and because it's on a new blank layer I can move it about. So the first thing I'll do is I'll go back down here. It's not essential we use black, but it makes it look pretty good as we're working. So let's just return to black and white. Black is my foreground color. I'm going to flood that selection with black. A nice easy shortcut key to remember: Alt backspace will always flood your foreground color. I'm going to remove the selection from the outer edge of that oblong with Ctrl+D. Now I'm going to pick up my move tool, and as I click and drag this shape around the artwork here, you'll see the smart guides pop up and do their work. For example, there's the midway point, so it snaps into position, and if I move to the left it snaps into position. So that square is perfectly in the center of my background layer. Now I'm not sure if the size of this is correct. Let's find out. What I'm going to do here is make a copy of what I've just created. Now the easiest way to do that is just to hit Ctrl+J. It's going to copy it but place it in exactly the same position. So with that move tool selected again, if I move this to the right, that I think is going to work for me. All I need now is a third square or oblong. So I can make a copy of the other one, Ctrl+J. Watch the smart guides help me out here. Snap. There we have our triptych artwork. How quick was that? Now I've done this demonstration once or twice before, and I think I got just a little bit lucky with my guess of the shape of that first oblong. So let me demonstrate what would happen if we got the shape a little bit wrong. I'll do that by creating a duplicate. I'm going to go up to my image menu and create a duplicate of our artwork. I'll just call this DUP for short, and I'll get rid of all of those layers, and you can see I can highlight all of them by holding the Control key and clicking each of them in turn. Then I can hit the delete key to get rid of them. So let me quickly pick up my rectangular marquee tool, and I'll make my shape just a little bit wider than it needs to be. I'll recreate my new blank layer. Alt backspace will flood the black. Control D will remove that selection. Picking up the move tool, I can now pick up my shape and make sure it's perfectly in the middle, and that's just nice. And I can make a copy with Ctrl+J. But of course when I move this to the right, it's quite obvious that I haven't got things quite right. Get rid of the one you've just copied just for a minute, because all we need to do with this one is to reduce the size. The height's okay, it's only the width. So we can use the free transform tool for that. Ctrl+T is a shortcut, but edit, free transform. I can just drag this in, hit the tick, pick up the move tool, recenter it, Ctrl+J to create that new layer, click and drag, and I can decide if the gap there is just right or I want it slightly wider. If I want it slightly wider, well, then I'll just do the same thing again. Ctrl+T, I'm not going to want much now, just a little amount. Hit the enter key, recenter, Ctrl+J to create the new layer, click and drag. There's the triptych on the right. Ctrl+J, click and drag. There's the triptych on the left, and the smart guides assisted me in positioning it perfectly, both in height and with the right gap between the center oblong shape. So where we are now, it doesn't really matter which one of the two pieces of artwork I use, but I think I'll close down the duplicate and we'll work with this one. Just a tiny little bit more of a gap between each of the shapes, but as you can see, each of the shapes is on its own separate layer. So let's select the center part, and we're going to open up some images to drop into our artwork. But before we move on to that, what we should be doing now is saving this as a Photoshop document. Now I've just done that, calling this layers triptych, so that I can close this down and come back later and I've got all of those layers safely saved. Now as you can see by the spinning round of the screen, I've just gone to my finished images and I have found this picture and open it up into Photoshop. You can see my layers triptych is sitting underneath. So what I need to do is to make a layered stack of this image with the artwork beneath. So I'm going to drag this tab from the top so I can see both parts temporarily. With the Move tool selected from the top of the toolbox, which is what I've got, I can click, drag and drop, and I can close this down. Now just for the moment, I'm going to pick up that shape and I'm going to move it roughly into position. But of course we've got a bit of a problem with size here. Well, here's a little tip, and really this is the demonstration of why layers is so powerful. If we go back to our layers palette, if I hold the Alt key while I move my cursor up between those two lines, you'll see that it changes. If I don't hold the Alt key, then nothing happens at all. But when I hold the Alt key and click, it wraps this image around our template shape. But it doesn't crop anything away. So with the Move tool still selected, I can move this image around. Now I can do it with click and drag with the mouse pointer, but I can also do it with the up and down arrow keys or the left and right keys. So as you can see, I can lift it up, I can lift it down, push it down until it's just perfectly placed, but we're a little bit to the right, so let's tap it to the left until we get it nicely centered. There we have the center of our triptych. Now wouldn't it be nice if the glasses were a little bit taller in the frame there, given that it's a centerpiece? Well, I'm going to cheat just a little bit. With this layer selected, I'm going to apply that free transform tool, Ctrl+T. Now I can't see the top of the bounding box, and yet that's where I want to get to drag it up a little bit. So here's another tip that you can use over and over again. Ctrl+0 is a set of shortcuts which always fit an image on screen. So if we've got a small image, it'll fit it on screen. If we've got a huge enlargement, it'll bring it back and fit it on screen. But here, when I do it, it takes account of the bounding box around the transform tool. So it does give me a little bit of space to work. Now generally speaking, I would be making this smaller, but here I want to drag it up, so I still don't have a great deal of space, but no problem, because if I touch the Control, Alt and the spacebar together, I can reduce the size because the zoom tool appears in minus mode. Now what I wanted to do was just something like that. And I'll hit that Ctrl+0 again to fit the image on screen. Now as you can see by the spinning round of the screen once again, I've gone into my archives and found a couple of images that I can fit in the outer triptych shapes. I've opened up two images this time. I've opened up this one and this one. So I can drag both of those out of the top of the screen using the tab. So we can see actually the triptych and the two images. So with the Move tool selected again, I can click, drag and drop and close that down. And with this one I can click, drag and drop, and I can close that down too. Now let's just sort out the layers on the right hand side because it's looking just a little bit of a jumble at the moment. I could remove the orange glasses from our eye line just for a moment by turning that layer off, and I can select the one with the blue glasses. Now this one is going to be located over the top of the shape for the left part of the triptych, so I need to pick that up and drag it up to the top and drop it over the top of that shape, so that when I hold the Alt key and move over that line and click, then the image wraps around that left hand shape, and then with my Move tool I can move it into position. Now you can see with this image that it is a little bit bigger than I need, so here again is where we can use that free transform tool, and you can see why the shortcut key of Ctrl+T is so useful. It's because we reach for the tool so often. And here I'm going to hit that Ctrl+0 again to bring the bounding box into play. Remember when we changed the size, in most cases we keep the height and width in register. But we don't have to. We can click this little chain link, but there is a shortcut. If we hold the Shift key and I drag in the corner toggle, then the height and the width remains in register. But I've got a little bit of a problem here, so I'm going to dispense with that, and I'm going to deliberately distort my image a little bit. It's not going to hurt at all. And I think that's looking pretty good. Hit the tick on the options bar to commit that change. Now let's have a look at that layer that I turned off. We'll bring it back into play. I'll drag it up the layered stack and drop it over the right hand shape. I'll hold my Alt key and link the two together, and I need to move it into place. Now it looks a bit odd, doesn't it? It's just suddenly disappeared. Well, in fact it hasn't. It's just over on the left hand side, and I can see that in my layers here. So once again, Ctrl+T to bring up Free Transform tool, Ctrl+0 to see the bounding box if we need to do that. And then I need to match this, maybe something like the other one. Let's have a look, see what we can do. The height's pretty good there. That looks pretty good. I need to come in on this side though. So I'm going to need to do something like that. Now we've got one other obvious thing we may want to do here. We may want to flip the glass on the right over so it's leaning in to create a nice balance between them all. But in actual fact, I think I would rather have two versions of the blue one in my triptych, but we'll go through the motions here first. So with this layer selected, I can flip just this image over. Let's do that by going to Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal. Now we've got a little bit of a mismatch here, but I would need to tweak that Free Transform tool to get that into play. But I think it would look much nicer as a triptych if I used this one over here. So that is what I'm going to do. I'll drag that one into the bin. I'll select the blue glasses and hit Ctrl+J to make a copy. I can drag that down over the top of that shape. Now when I link it, it will, well, it's not going to disappear because we can see the other one, but it would disappear if it wasn't being shown by the other image on top. So we'll just select it and then pick up the Move tool and move it across. You'll see what I mean as I do it. There you go. But of course we need to flip that over as well, so Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal. Maybe I could just nudge that in a little bit. No, I haven't got a lot of space to do that, so it looks like that is it. But it hasn't taken us long to create, and it looks pretty good. I hope you'll agree. Now I've just saved what I've got on screen here, and I've called it Triptych Glasses, because what I'm going to choose to do now is to select the center two layers, the two that make up that middle part, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to just merge those layers, just the two I've selected. Then the next two, the one on the right, right click, merge layers, and then the one on the left. Because we're going to add a little bit of refinement here. Now with any one of these selected, we'll start with the shape over on the left. I'm going to go back down to the bottom of my layers to the effects. I'm not going to select any of these, I'm just going to bring up the blending options so we can actually look at all of the options that we have here. Now the main option we want here is stroke. So I'm going to tick the little box here to apply the stroke. Generally speaking, it will apply the last setting we used, so don't be too surprised if something suddenly appears. In this case it hasn't. So we need to adjust the parameters for the stroke. So I'm going to select the stroke, I can go to the color option, and that's why we're not seeing anything. We've got a very light tone selected, so I'm going to click the color panel and select black. I'm going to place the line on the inside of the image, but 1 pixel is hardly showing up at all. So I'm going to overtype that with 3 pixels. Now it doesn't look very strong in the picture, but the beauty of using layer styles is we can always come in and adjust them later. But I will increase it a little bit so you can see it a bit more clearly. I'll give it a 5 pixel line on the inside of the image, and we're going to use black. Now let's look at a drop shadow. Let me tick the drop shadow and highlight the values for that too. Once again, this will always remember the last settings that were used, and I seem to have a setting here that's very low. I'm going to push the distance up to about 8, and maybe the size up to about 8. Still not doing a great deal, so I'm going to use the sliders to speed this up a little bit. There you can see that if you look carefully, you can see the shadow coming out, and I'll bring the distance up a little bit too, and also the opacity. So you can see now we've got a drop shadow appearing all the way around. It's as though the image has been lifted from that background. Now we've obviously got lots of other options here, but I think we've used the 2 key ones for a triptych, so I'm going to click OK. You can see what happens. The effects are placed on that panel on the left hand side. We can see what we have, stroke and drop shadow, and of course if we save this as a Photoshop file, we can come back and change these at any time. If I wanted to increase the stroke, for example, I can just double click the stroke, go straight into it and increase it to 7 if that was what I felt was right, and click OK. But once we've got a set of effects applied to one of those layers, then we can just drag them to the other layers too. If I wanted to move the effects from this layer to the other side, I just click and drag them. But the object of the exercise is to add them to all layers. So what we do then is hold the Alt key. Then when I click and drag, I'm copying them from one to the other. And we'll do the same to the center, and then we'll have a timeout and have a look at what we've created. Now I think that all looks pretty good, and I've saved my artwork now, calling it Triptych Glasses 2. So I've got all stages of what I've done here nicely saved on my computer should I want to come back tomorrow morning and make a change. But of course the power of layers is that we can now experiment with perhaps a slightly different presentation technique. Let me just demonstrate by opening up those layers once again. I can go back down here, for example, and maybe choose a different color for the background. I don't think black would be appropriate, but I think maybe a charcoal color maybe, so let's try that. Let's go to the color picker at the bottom of the toolbox, click it, and we'll select a dark, but certainly a, let's move up to the blue tones, make sure we don't have any warmth coming in there. So a charcoal color is what I'm looking for. Click OK. I can now flood my background with color. Alt backspace will do that. Now let me hit Ctrl+0 so we get the whole thing in the screen. Now as soon as we flood the background with a bit more of a neutral color, then perhaps having that black line around the edge is not entirely suitable. So let me go back to that triptych shape at the top, double click the stroke, double click or click the color. I'm not going to pick white. Sometimes white can be a bit overpowering. I sometimes just come down a little bit. Although it's a greyish color, it still appears to be white when we apply it. We could decide to drop the size down to say something like 5. and click OK. And then I can quickly apply that to the others by holding that Alt key and just dragging it from one to the other. And I've dragged the entire layer, so I'm going to hit Ctrl+Z, hold the Alt key and make sure I pick up the effects a bit more carefully this time. But as you can see, I can drag them to the other layers. The other thing we can do is to add a little bit of texture here. Let me pick up the zoom tool and I'll zoom up to the top right, because we've added computer generated color here, and it may be nice to add just a little bit of tone here. And one of my favorites, make sure you select the layer, is a simple noise filter, noise, add noise. I like to use Gaussian monochrome noise, something like 2 or 3. I think 3 is going to be good enough, because when I click OK and we hit Ctrl+0, you're hardly going to see that texture, but when it's printed it will look very nice. Now we could even pick up our eyedropper tool from the toolbox on the left and sample colours from within the 3 parts of the triptych and produce the background with some complementary colours that may work quite well. But I quite liked the white that I had originally. I think it worked particularly well. Now I could fix that by going to my undo history and stepping back, but let's just quickly recreate it. It's very quick to do, because if I look over to the left hand side and I see that I've got white as my background color, I can just hit Control backspace and there's my white. But of course we lose the edge of our pictures, so we'd need to go back to our stroke and double click it. I'll reselect black, and black looks okay there at 5 pixels, so I'll live with that this time. Holding the Alt key, I can drag the effects onto each of those layers, and there's the triptych complete. Of course we would save it, as I said, as a Photoshop file retaining all of those layers, but at some stage we may wish to flatten to finish the image, and certainly if we're going to print it. Now if we did want to print this image, let's take a look and see what sort of size we're going to get. So if I go to Image and Image Size, there you can see we would get at 300 pixels per inch, we would be able to create an image 20 inches by 11. But if you had a project where you wanted a much bigger print, then when you select and create your initial background, which we did at 6000 pixels by 3375, you would just make that the appropriate size for the artwork you're creating. Now I've always enjoyed this part of image editing, how we can present our images in many different ways. We do have to be just a little bit careful though, because great presentation will not improve a poor image. But good presentation with a good image, and now you're talking.